Washington, D.C., 1947. An army surgeon named Edwin Hill submitted a report recommending that Japanese scientists who had vivisected living prisoners without anesthesia be granted full immunity from war crimes prosecution in exchange for their data. The report was accepted. Unit 731 was established in 1935 in Harbin, Manchuria, in the northeastern reaches of a China already being consumed by Japanese occupation. It operated under the command of Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii, a physician and military officer who had argued with some success that biological weapons represented the future of modern warfare. The unit was given a campus, a sprawling compound of laboratories, dormitories, crematoria, and holding cells spread across the frozen Manchurian plain. Its official designation was the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army. The name was chosen deliberately. It described, with bureaucratic precision, the opposite of what occurred inside. The prisoners brought to that compound were called Maruta. The word means logs. It was the informal designation used by researchers and staff, a linguistic compression that transformed a person into a unit of material. The estimated number of individuals who entered the facility and died there is placed at around 3,000, though the documentary record was largely destroyed before Soviet forces arrived in August 1945. What survived in testimony and partial records describes a systematic program of human experimentation, deliberate infection with plague, cholera, and typhoid, frostbite induction through prolonged exposure to sub-zero temperatures, vivisection performed on subjects while they remained conscious, their organs removed and examined in sequence to observe the progression of induced disease in living tissue. There was no anesthesia. The researchers noted this in their reports. It was, in several instances, presented as a methodological choice. Anesthesia, they argued, might compromise the results. By the summer of 1945, the war in the Pacific had compressed to its final months. Japan's military position was deteriorating. Ishii ordered the facility dismantled, the records burned, and the remaining subjects killed. Staff was sworn to secrecy. The compound was partially demolished. Ishii himself disappeared briefly into the countryside before surfacing in Tokyo, where he lived quietly, apparently waiting to see what the new order would require of him. What it required became apparent quickly. American occupation forces arrived in Japan with two distinct and not always compatible mandates: to prosecute Japanese war crimes and to gather whatever intelligence the defeated empire had accumulated that might be useful in the coming confrontation with the Soviet Union. These two objectives met in the case of Unit 731, and one of them won. The Soviets had already captured several Unit 731 researchers and conducted their own trial at Khabarovsk in December 1949, convicting 12 Japanese defendants on charges of biological warfare. American officials, aware of this, were also aware that the Soviets did not have Ishii and did not have the full archive of experimental data. What the Americans had by late 1947 was access to both. Edwin Hill, Chief of Basic Sciences at Camp Detrick, the U.S. Army's biological warfare research facility in Maryland, traveled to Japan with his colleague Joseph Victor. They met with Ishii and with other senior researchers from the program. They reviewed the data. Hill and Victor then filed their report to Washington. The experimental results, they wrote, were absolutely invaluable. They could not have been obtained in the United States because of the scruples attached to human experimentation. The phrasing is precise and worth sitting with. Scruples, a word for ethical hesitation. The report identified American moral standards not as a baseline, but as an obstacle, one that the Japanese researchers had, from the American government's new perspective, helpfully circumvented. General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander of the Allied powers in occupied Japan, personally approved the immunity arrangement. The decision was communicated to the Allied prosecution teams conducting the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal. communicated, that is, in the sense that it was withheld from them entirely. The prosecutors building cases against Japanese military and political leadership had no knowledge that a parallel negotiation had concluded, that the men whose names appeared in testimony about Manchurian atrocities had been quietly removed from the list of actionable targets. The Tokyo tribunal proceeded. The Unit 731 leadership did not appear before it. The payment was 250,000 yen. That figure appears in declassified National Archives documents. The price paid to Unit 731 researchers for the experimental data collected from 3,000 people who had been designated as logs. The transaction was recorded. The secrecy surrounding it was deliberate and sustained. Allied prosecutors at Nuremberg, building the legal architecture that would define war crimes for the following century, were constructing their cases at the same moment this exchange was being finalized. The two processes ran concurrently and in enforced ignorance of each other. Shiro Ishii lived in Tokyo. He saw his country rebuilt. He saw the occupation end, the treaties signed, the economy recover. He is reported to have converted to Catholicism in his later years, though the documentary basis for this is thin. He died of throat cancer in 1959. He was never charged. He was never tried. The files that described what he had authorized and overseen existed, in various forms, in American government archives, and the men who had read them had concluded that this was the correct outcome. What the declassified record cannot answer, what it approaches and then retreats from, is the question of what the researchers were told when the deal was made. Whether they understood the immunity as a reward, a transaction, or simply the natural resolution of a situation in which the powerful had, once again, looked at what had been done and decided it was more useful than it was wrong. 3,000 people entered that compound. The data derived from what was done to them was purchased, classified, and absorbed into the research programs of the nation that was simultaneously prosecuting others for crimes of the same category. The files exist, they are accessible, and the question they leave behind, about what immunity means, about who decides when a crime becomes a resource, is one that the historical record raises and declines to answer.